Hi, it's Steve with Paladino Power Project, and in this video, I'd like to explain why fixed power duration relationships do not exist. Many times you'll hear uh, relationships, power duration relationships that are cited, and they cite a specific relationship, and that it just doesn't exist because we're dealing with populations. And here's some examples that really are not real true. They're oversimplified and eliminate the bell-shaped curve and the variance contained in trying to identify that each of these relationships. So you'll hear CP FTP is 95% of 20-minute mean maximal power. No, not it's not a fixed relationship. CP is 88% of power of VO2 max in runners. Nope, not fixed relationship. 1 mile power is 118% of CPFTP. Nope. 5K power is 103% of CPFTP. Nope. Marathon power is 88% of CPFTP. Nope. Time to exhaustion at CPFTP is 60 minutes. Nope. And this one, time to exhaustion at power VO2 max is 6 minutes. No. These are all oversimplified and imply a fixed power duration relationship. So, why are they not fixed? Because we're dealing with a lot of variables, and those variables can be for even for the individual, the training focus and fitness and phase of training. For example, a CP to power VO2 max relationship may vary between a base phase of training and a race specific phase of training, or a race prep phase of training. It may vary across sport disciplines. In other words, in cycling, you may have one range, and in a running group, you have a different range. For example, the 95% of 20-minute power, that was established for cyclists, and it's actually lower than that for most cyclists. But for runners, it's higher than that. The relationship between CP and power VO2 max is also tends to be lower in cyclists and higher in runners. So the, those are some variables, but there's also the variables of protocols and models varying. So, for example, VO2 max there may involve one protocol and model, and CP or FTP involve a different protocol and model. Now you're comparing estimates resulted from two different protocols and models. So those are considerations. But I want to go a little bit more in depth into these next three. One is that there is a population variation on time to exhaustion. Depends on fitness, depends on caliber of runner. Elites tend to be longer, and recreational athletes tend to be shorter on the time to exhaustion at these various markers. And I'll show you that in a second. Population variation in reserve work capacity, or W prime. That's going to create a lot of variation whenever you're at intensities higher than CP-FTP. And consequently, when you're comparing something at FTP-CP with something that's higher intensity, that this W prime or RWC starts to play into that the percentage that you see between those two those two fixed markers. And then also population variation, race duration. All right. So, meaning you may be talking about a marathon, but some people run a marathon in 4.5 hours, and some people run a marathon in 2 hours and 5 minutes. And power varies with duration, not based on race distance, but on duration. So these are some of the variables that come into play that make the power duration relationships, when comparing a couple points, why they're variable. And so the first one is this concept of time to exhaustion is variable across a population. For example, time to exhaustion for CP-FTP ranges from 30 minutes to maybe 70 minutes, about 50 plus or minus 20 minutes, where recreational racers might be in the lower end and elites might be in the upper end for that. Same thing with time to exhaustion at power VO2 max. It's about maybe 3 to 3.5 minutes up to 7.5 to 8 minutes, about 5 plus or minus 2 minutes. With recreational racers occupying the lower end and elites occupying the higher end of that range. But it's variable. So when we're saying, oh, the percentage of FTP CP versus power VO2 max is XYZ. No, because these variables themselves are each independently variable. So that's one consideration. Then there's the W prime, which I mentioned in a couple of slides earlier. Once you get to higher intensities than FTP or CP, the individual's W prime or RWC determines the power that can be sustained for a given period of time. So that the relationship between FTP and 20 minutes, for example, is going to be different for a high W prime individual versus a low W prime or RWC individual. So the variation in W prime or RWC, reserve work capacity, in a population will affect power duration relationships. And so there's another one. And then we talk about duration, race duration. Well, here's an example. A 4.5 hour marathon may be running that marathon at about 82% of their CP FTP, while a sub 205 marathoner is doing it closer to 97% of their FTP CP. Power duration. So the longer the duration, the lower the power, the lower percentage of FTP CP. So again, to say, marathons are executed at 88% of FTP or CP is just incorrect, because there's a population to consider. So really, when we go back to those various elements, and there's many more relationships that people try to talk about, but when we look at those ones that we talked about earlier, there's actually a range. It's not a fixed. So for runners, CP FTP is roughly about 96 to 98% of 20-minute mean maximal power. They have a low W prime, and for recreational runners, their time to exhaustion at CP FTP is shorter than, say, an elite. So runners tend to be a little bit higher as CP as a percentage of 20-minute max. Same thing with CP as a percentage of power VO2 max. It ranges from about 86% to 94%. With really fit runners, elite runners are way up here, 94, 95% even. Most of the runners I work with are 88% and higher of of power of VO2 max CP. But there's a range across individuals. It's not fixed. 1 mile power can be 113% for, say, a 7.5 minute miler, to 123% to a sub 4 minute miler. 5K, again, same thing, 102% for a slower 5K runner and 111% for world class. Marathon, same thing, 82%. We talked about this in the previous slide. 82 to 97%. It's not fixed. There's a range. Time to exhaustion, we've already covered this. These factors, that's also a range. It's not fixed. So when we are looking at power duration relationships and we're citing them, most often we're citing a population-based relationship. And you got to remember there's a bell-shaped curve, and so there's a lot of variation. Versus the individual, where the relationship may be a lot tighter. Or even if you're looking at an elite group, that's a much tighter relationship than, say, a broad group of runners, from recreational runners to elites. So as you tighten up or make the population more homogeneous, then you get to a little bit tighter, but still some variation in these various power duration relationships. So remember, we are ultimately we're working towards optimizing the individual. So we have to take these quoted power duration relationships with a grain of salt in terms of where that runner occupies their spot on this bell-shaped curve when you interpret their power duration relationship versus something that's quoted as a population. So hopefully that helps understand a little bit about comparing points on a power duration curve and establishing relationships between a couple of different points. So thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.